I smiled when I read the message. Not the smile you give when something is funny, the smile you give when you already knew it was coming, when you had spent 6 months preparing for exactly this moment, and the moment had finally arrived. My name is Graham. Graham Elliot. I am 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a forensic accountant with a mid-sized firm in Brisbane, and before I retired, I had helped unravel more financial crimes than I can count. Falsified invoices, hidden assets, shell companies built like Russian dolls, one inside another. I had seen every variation of deception that money could inspire. I never imagined I would one day have to use those same skills to protect myself from my own son. Let me tell you how it started. My wife, Patricia, passed away 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer. We had 38 years together, and every one of them was worth something. She was the one who kept the house warm. Not literally, she was always cold, always stealing the blanket, but emotionally. When she died, the house in Chapel Hill became very quiet and very large. I rattled around in it like a marble in a shoebox. My son, Daniel, was 34 at the time. He had always been what you might politely call restless. 4 jobs in 5 years. A share house in Fortitude Valley, with 3 other men who all seemed to work in industries I could never quite identify. Patricia used to say he just hadn't found his thing yet. She said it with such genuine confidence that I almost believed her every time. After she died, Daniel came around more often. I told myself it was grief. We were both grieving. He would sit at the kitchen table and drink my coffee and talk about Patricia, and those evenings meant something to me. I was lonely. I will not pretend otherwise. About 18 months after Patricia died, Daniel told me he had met someone. Her name was Cassandra. He brought her to Sunday dinner one evening in March. This would have been about 2.5 years ago now, and I remember thinking she was charming in a way that was just slightly too polished. She laughed at everything Daniel said. She complimented my cooking 3 times. She asked me questions about my career with an attentiveness that felt, in retrospect, more like research than interest. But I told myself I was being cynical, an old man suspicious of his son's happiness. I pushed the feeling aside. Over the following months, Daniel and Cassandra became serious very quickly. By July, they were talking about moving in together. By September, he mentioned, almost casually, that they were thinking about buying a property. A small place on the Sunshine Coast, he said. Nothing fancy. Just somewhere to start. I asked how they planned to finance it. He said they were looking at options. 2 weeks later, he asked if I would be willing to act as guarantor on a loan. I said I would think about it. I thought about it. I said, no. He did not push hard. He just nodded and said he understood. And then the subject shifted, and I thought that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. In late October, I had a fall. Not serious, a cracked rib and some bruising, but I was in the Greenslopes Hospital for 4 days for observation because of my blood pressure, which has always been a nuisance. Daniel came to visit each day, which touched me. On the 2nd day, he brought some paperwork he said my solicitor had sent over. He said it was mostly updated estate documentation, a few routine forms my solicitor had been nudging me about for months. I was tired. I was on blood pressure medication that made me foggy in the mornings. The forms were dense, and I was not wearing my reading glasses because they were at home. Daniel said he had spoken to my solicitor directly, and everything was standard. He pointed to where I needed to sign. I signed. I am a forensic accountant of 31 years, and I signed documents I did not read properly. I have thought about that moment many times since. Tiredness, trust, and a hospital bed are a dangerous combination. What I had signed was not estate documentation. It was a broad power of attorney, granting Daniel full authority to act on my behalf in all financial and legal matters. Effective immediately, I did not find out for another 6 weeks. The discovery happened because of my neighbor, a retired school teacher named Beverly, who has lived next door for over 20 years and who still brings me tomatoes from her garden every summer. Beverly mentioned, very gently, over the fence one Wednesday morning, that she had seen a man she didn't recognize taking photographs of the exterior of my house. 2 men, actually, one with a camera and one with a clipboard. They had walked the perimeter and then driven away in a white ute with no signage on the door. I rang my property manager that afternoon. I had 2 investment properties, both in Brisbane's inner south, that Patricia and I had purchased in the 90s. The property manager sounded confused when I called. She said she had already spoken to my son about both properties. She said he had requested that the rental agreements be reviewed in preparation for sale. She said she had assumed I knew. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that call. Then I rang my bank. I had 3 accounts: a day-to-day account, a term deposit that Patricia and I had built over 20 years, sitting at just over $310,000, and a third account, a smaller one, that I used for rates, insurance, and property-related expenses. The term deposit account now had $47,000 in it. The difference, $263,000, had been transferred over 5 separate transactions across 3 weeks, all authorized under the power of attorney. I sat with that information for a long time. Then I did something that perhaps surprised me more than anything else that day. I did not cry. I did not ring Daniel. I did not ring the police. I rang a solicitor I had used once years earlier, a quietly formidable woman named Margaret, and I told her exactly what I had found. She told me not to make any contact with Daniel yet. She told me to come into her office the next morning. That night I went to my filing cabinet, where I keep every piece of paper I have ever signed in labeled folders going back 20 years. I found no copy of the power of attorney because I had not been given one. I wrote down everything I could remember about the day in the hospital, the time, what Daniel had said, the fact that I had not had my reading glasses, the fact that my blood pressure medication had been adjusted the previous day. Margaret was precise and unhurried. She reviewed what I brought her and made her own notes. She told me the power of attorney had been drafted by a private document preparation service rather than by my actual solicitor. Daniel had used the firm's name to reassure me, but had never involved them. That was our first lever. She also told me that even under a valid POA, the attorney has a fiduciary duty to act in the principal's interests, and that transferring funds to third-party accounts for personal use was a straightforward breach. She said, we had grounds. She also said something that turned a key inside me. She said, Graham, before we do anything formal, I'd like you to consider engaging a private investigator. Not to find evidence for the case, we have enough of that, but to understand the full picture. Because in my experience, there is almost always more to understand. I took her advice. The investigator I used was a former Queensland police detective named Robert, a methodical man who wore the same gray jacket every time I saw him and took notes in a spiral-bound pad with a pen he kept behind his ear. I gave him Cassandra's full name, Cassandra Vreeland, and what I knew about her background. Robert came back to me in 3 weeks. What he found was not entirely surprising, given what I had come to suspect, but it was still difficult to read in black and white. Cassandra Vreeland had been engaged twice before. The first engagement, in New South Wales, had ended with the fiancé's parents losing a significant amount of money that had been placed in a joint account. There had been a complaint made to police, but no charges laid. The second engagement, in South Australia, had resulted in a civil dispute over a business loan that had never been repaid. In both cases, the relationship had ended abruptly after the financial damage was done. In both cases, Cassandra had moved interstate shortly afterward. Robert also found that the account into which my money had been transferred belonged to a company registered in Queensland 3 months earlier. The sole director of that company was Cassandra Vreeland. Daniel's name was nowhere on the company documents. I read that detail several times. I thought about my son, restless and searching, who had loved his mother and who used to fall asleep watching cricket in that same armchair Patricia had reupholstered twice because she knew he loved it. I thought about how easy it is, when you are lost and someone attentive turns their full warmth toward you, to become something you were not before. That did not excuse what he had done. It did not make any of it acceptable, but it changed the shape of what I was dealing with. I was not facing a cold and calculating son. I was facing a son who had been recruited by someone cold and calculating, and who had, at some point, made choices that crossed lines that cannot be uncrossed. I went back to Margaret with Robert's report. She added it to what we had already built. Then she told me there was something important I needed to know about the investment properties. When Patricia died, she had placed both investment properties into a discretionary family trust as part of her estate planning. We had done it together, on the advice of our accountant, for tax and asset protection purposes. The trust deed specified that the trustee, which was a corporate trustee we had established, was the only entity with authority to sell or transfer the properties. The power of attorney that Daniel had obtained gave him authority over my personal accounts and assets held in my name. It gave him no authority over the trust assets whatsoever. Daniel had apparently not understood this, or Cassandra had not understood this, because I had come to believe that the architecture of this plan had been hers. The two properties could not be sold without my direct involvement as the trust's appointor. Any attempted sale without my authorization would have collapsed at settlement. They had taken my money, but the larger prize, the investment properties, which together were worth considerably more than the term deposit, was never accessible to them. I did not tell Daniel that I knew. This is the part that requires some explanation, because I imagine you might wonder why a man who had just discovered his son had stolen from him would choose silence over confrontation. The answer is that Margaret advised me to wait, and I had learned over 31 years of examining other people's financial disasters that the instinct to confront is often the enemy of the outcome you actually want. We spent the next 2 months documenting everything, preparing the formal complaint to Queensland Police, engaging a barrister for potential civil recovery proceedings, and placing formal holds on my accounts to prevent any further movement. The bank was cooperative once we presented the evidence of unauthorized use under a potentially fraudulent POA. During those 2 months, Daniel continued to come to Sunday dinner. I cooked. We talked. He asked me once if I had spoken to my solicitor about updating my will, and I said I had an appointment coming up. He seemed satisfied with that. I watched his face across the table and tried to find the version of him I had known before all of this. The boy who had come home from school, sunburnt and talking too fast about whatever had happened that day, and I found traces of him there, which made everything both easier and harder. 3 weeks before the police were scheduled to attend, Cassandra called off the engagement. She told Daniel she was moving to Victoria for a work opportunity. She was gone within days. Her company, the one holding my money, was deregistered the following week, but not before Margaret's barrister had secured a freezing order over its assets. We recovered $219,000. The remaining $44,000 had already been spent, and civil recovery on that portion would have cost more in legal fees than it was worth. I made my peace with that. Daniel came to me 3 days after Cassandra left. He sat in the kitchen, in the same chair he always sits in, and he did not look like a man who had gotten away with something. He looked like a man who had woken up in a place he did not recognize and could not explain how he had arrived there. He started to speak twice and stopped both times. I let him sit with it. When he finally got words out, they were not the words I expected. He did not say he was sorry for taking the money not first. Anyway, the first thing he said was that he thought she had loved him. I told him that I believed he had believed that. Then he asked how I knew. I told him that I had known for a long time, and that I had said nothing because saying something too early would have given him an exit from a situation that needed to reach its own conclusion. I told him that I was not certain he would have believed me if I had told him 6 months ago. I am still not certain he would have. He sat there while I told him everything. The POA, the transfers, Robert's report, Cassandra's history in 2 other states, the freezing order, all of it. He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said he would pay me back. Every dollar, however long it took. I told him that we would speak to Margaret together and work out a formal arrangement. Not because I did not trust him, though trust would need to be rebuilt slowly in the only way it can be rebuilt, which is through time and consistency, but because formal arrangements protect relationships in ways that informal promises cannot. We had both learned something about the importance of documented agreements. The matter with Queensland Police is ongoing. Charges were filed relating to the fraudulent preparation of the power of attorney and the misappropriation of funds. Cassandra's whereabouts in Victoria were confirmed, and she has been interviewed. I cannot say more than that at this stage. What I can tell you is that I still have the house in Chapel Hill. I still have both investment properties. I still have enough in the term deposit, after the recovery, to see me through whatever years I have left without anxiety. And Daniel still comes to Sunday dinner. He comes earlier now, and he stays later. He fixed the gate hinge that has been loose for 3 years. Last month he drove me to a cardiology follow-up and sat in the waiting room for 2 hours without complaint. We do not talk about Cassandra very much. We do not talk about Cassandra very much. We talk about Patricia sometimes. We talk about cricket. We talk about what it might look like to slowly, carefully rebuild something that was very nearly destroyed. It is not uncomplicated. I will not offer you a tidy version of what our relationship looks like now, because it is not tidy. Trust, once it has been broken in the particular way ours was broken, does not return to its original shape. What grows back is different. Sturdier in some places, perhaps. More deliberately constructed. Less taken for granted. But it is growing back. That matters more than I expected it to. If there is anything I want you to take from this story, it is a handful of things I wish someone had told me before any of this happened. A power of attorney is one of the most powerful legal documents you will ever sign. It is not routine paperwork. It is not a formality. It gives another person the legal authority to act as if they are you. In every financial and legal context, that statement implies. You should never sign one while medicated, fatigued, or without your own reading glasses. You should never sign one prepared by someone other than your own solicitor. You should request a copy immediately, and you should understand precisely and completely what it authorizes before your pen touches the paper. If someone presents you with documents in a hospital bed and tells you they are routine, ask for 48 hours to have your solicitor review them. A person acting in your genuine interest will not object to that request. A person who objects to that request is telling you something important. Financial abuse of older Australians is more common than most people realize, and it is most commonly perpetrated not by strangers, but by family members and intimate partners, people whose access to your trust is precisely what makes them dangerous. The Australian Institute of Family Studies estimates it affects hundreds of thousands of older Australians each year, and the majority of cases are never formally reported. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Ring your solicitor before you ring your family member. The call to your family member will still be there to make later. Evidence has a way of disappearing. Assets held in a properly structured trust are not accessible via a personal power of attorney. If you have investment properties or substantial assets, speak to an estate planning solicitor and a financial advisor about whether a trust structure makes sense for your situation. It is not just for wealthy people. Patricia and I did it on the advice of our accountant when the properties were worth a fraction of what they are now. And that decision is the reason I am sitting in my own home writing this today. And finally, this is the hardest one. Love is not a defense against harm, but it is also not incompatible with accountability. You can love someone and still insist that what they did had consequences. You can forgive someone and still require them to make it right. Those two things are not opposites. In fact, I think refusing to hold the people we love accountable is sometimes the most unloving thing we can do. It tells them that we do not believe they are capable of better. Daniel is capable of better. I intend to give him the opportunity to demonstrate that. I am 67 years old. I have buried my wife and nearly lost my life savings and spent 6 months eating Sunday roast across the table from a son who did not know I was building a legal case around him. None of that is the story I expected to be telling at this point in my life. But I am still here. The gate hinge is fixed. And this morning, Beverly brought tomatoes over the fence and said the garden is looking better than it has in years. That is enough. For now, that is more than enough.